Josh Schlossberg. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, eco-integrityalliance.org, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the modern ecological crisis. For this episode, we have Sam Hitt. He is president of Santa Fe Forest Coalition, and I'm going to have Sam talk a little bit about himself for a couple minutes because I believe Sam himself is enough of a story rather than the topics we're going to get into. So Sam, tell us a little bit about your history in the environmental protection world, please.
Well, thanks, Josh, for having me. And I guess it starts with my father, who was a forester, trained at the University of Idaho. And as I got into teenage years, I started to question his basically pro-logging stance, in particular having to do with old growth forests. And so we'd have these long debates, and of course I would always lose them because he knew a lot more than I did. So I came to the Southwest to go to St. John's College back in 1966. So I was 18 years old, and my dad required that we learned all the trees. I grew up in Michigan, so it was the oaks and maples and the hardwoods in general. So there weren't a lot of conifers. So coming to Santa Fe was a real eye-opener. I drove up toward the ski basin here in Santa Fe, which is just east of town, and I didn't know anything. I went to where the pavement stopped and took a walk at a place called Black Canyon. I still go to Black Canyon these days. It's kind of a little isolated jewel of primary ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, and aspen forests. So in any case, toward the end of his life, my dad finally came around to recognizing the value of old growth forests. He was trained to think of old growth as biological deserts, as 2x4s rotting on the stump, as kind of a wasteland. I mean, this was not habitat for game species, elk and deer. And, he was an avid hunter like all my relatives were. And it didn't seem this habitat didn't seem to provide vibrant life. I mean, at night there were owls and there were salamanders and squirrels, but it didn't really attract the attention of people like my dad, who was trained as a forester. So I was actually proud of my dad that toward the end of his life that he came around to see the value. He kept informed, and so we did have a reconciliation at the end of his life. So when I came to Santa Fe, I certainly did not want to get into forestry, but after about a decade or so, I was sucked in to a debate over spraying a broad spectrum insecticide over the national forest to control a native insect, the western spruce budworm. Still around, but they're no longer spraying because we engaged, beginning in 1981, a campaign to end the spraying of carbaryl, this broad spectrum chemical sold under the trade name 7, still widely available. It's a teratogenic chemical, causes birth defects, and it should not be on the market. But spraying it over our public lands, national forests, was just insanity. It was basically a 7-year campaign, Josh. And it was just a few of us. We tried to get the Sierra Club and Audubon Society and some of the bigger national groups involved, not interested. We basically got our butts kicked in the media. The local papers thought we were a bunch of firebrands who didn't know what we were talking about, that these insects were really causing horrible devastation to the forests. And we got kicked by the politicians too. At the time, Senator Pete Domenici was the most powerful politician in New Mexico. He was head of the Senate Budget Committee, and we would meet with him in Washington and try to get that line item for spraying taken out of the budget. Well, I remember very distinctly in one visit to his office, he pounded on his big mahogany desk so hard that the papers just sort of shook on top of this, on top of the desktop. That's about all the only thing I remember. I don't remember a word of what he said. It was he was known for his volcanic anger, and that was certainly an example of that. So we lost with the politicians, we lost with the media, we lost with the major environmental groups, and that was after 6 years. My friend Gary Schroet and a few other people just about ready to give up. They were planning to spray 60,000 acres in the Carson National Forest. The planes are going to take off from the Angel Fire Airport just east of Taos. And I had, of course, talk to everybody I could think of about this. And I had happened to mention to a few women the dangers of carbaryl. And there's a Girl Scout camp that's right close by the airport. It's been there for a long time. And those ladies had spoken to their daughters who were at the Girl Scout camp at that time. It was 1987, I believe it was June. And the Girl Scouts, bless her heart, got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and blockaded the runway. Did not let the spray planes take off. There happened to be a photographer there, and front page news on the Santa Fe, New Mexican, all the TV stations. I mean, it was something that just happened. It wasn't a predicted action. It wasn't a planned action, but it stopped the spray program. Literally, the spray program disappeared within 6 months. The minute she backed down, the media started to see the strength of our argument. It was a crazy program because the budworm main host is white fir. White fir is considered a shade-tolerant weed by the Forest Service. It's not cut for timber or those are the 2x4s that are very wavy and low value. So the budworm was beneficial to the ecosystem just from the narrow perspective that the agency looks at the forest. So we got the program ended. It was the last major spray program, the Carson and Santa Fe National Forests in the late 80s. They also had sprayed in Eastern Oregon and Northern Rockies, but they had stopped those programs. So, yeah, we won. And we won because we didn't give up. And we had every right to give up. But giving up means you never win. So you just plod forward and don't assume in a sort of arrogance or hubris that you know the outcome. You don't know the outcome. The outcome is unpredictable, and just stay in the saddle and go forward, and strange things happen, and suddenly sometimes you win. Of course, not always. So that's sort of the story how I got involved. And I started a group called Forest Guardians after that, because I got, again, concerned about the old growth issue. This was the spotted owl issue had just been raging in the media in the late 80s. Dr. Robin Silver in Phoenix had filed a 2-page petition to list the Mexican spotted owl under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. And they were entering the court cases that eventually resulted in the listing of the Mexican spotted owl as a subspecies of spotted owl that's found in the Southwest. In those days, Karan Suckling and Peter Galvin and Todd Schulke, the founders of what's now called the Center for Biological Diversity, were owl surveyors, and we would meet at my little office in Santa Fe. They would come in after staying up many nights, kind of groggy, and we would talk forest ecology and spotted owl preservation. So Forest Guardians, I left in the early 2000s, and I handed it over to John Horning, who, bless his heart, did a great job. And it's now Wild Earth Guardians. And, as soon as I left, it started to do great. So I am, my skills are not management, fundraising, and being the head of a large organization, of which Wild Earth Guardians now is. John has just retired from Guardians, and they have a new ED, Hop Hopkins, who I haven't met yet, but I'm looking forward to. So that's kind of in a capsule, sort of my involvement in forest issues here in the Southwest.
That's excellent. And that's a great story there, great history, and lots of great lessons as well. So tell us a little bit about your current organization.
Yeah, so so I sort of have developed this philosophy over the years of keeping our eye on the prize. The prize really in public lands is to decommercialize public land, to end commercial logging, livestock grazing, mining on the 600 million acres or so of public lands, mostly in the West. Forest Service is about 190 million acres. About 2/3 of those are forested acres. That's a long-term goal, and I've shared that goal with many great activists here in the West, but we're not going to see that tomorrow overnight, but also we're not going to give up. So to keep the enthusiasm going, I guess, to keep the sense of possibility open, take on smaller struggles, because you need victories, you need successes to enhance your activism, to make it so you can get up in the morning and continue doing what should be done. So I'm very attached to a species of tree here in the Southwest, not a common species, called white pine. There's 8 species of white pines in North America. The white bark pine, which is a high elevation pine, just got listed as a threatened species. It's mainly in the Northern Rockies and in Canada. It doesn't quite get down to the Southern Rockies here in northern New Mexico, but it's affected by a devastating disease called the white pine blister rust that was introduced at the turn of the last century from Europe and has just about wiped out another white pine, the western white pine, which is similar to the eastern white pine that grows in New England. The western white pine grows in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, and we're down to about 5% of western white pine. However, it's still being logged. It's just amazing. It's back in the day, it was logged for matchsticks, if you can believe. In any case, the 2 species of white pine we have here are southwestern white pine, which is the center of diversity is in northern Mexico, in Chihuahua and Sinaloa, the Sierra Madres, which I've seen the tree down there. It's a beautiful tree. It gets as far north as right here, just north of Santa Fe. It's northern extreme of its range, the southwestern white pine. And then we have another white pine coming down from the Arctic Circle, from the Canadian Rockies, which is the limber pine. So limber pine, again, is another high elevation pine, but it's quite variable. It also grows at lower elevations. So this is the only area in North America that I'm aware of where you have 2 species of white pine overlapping in the same area. And as happens in nature, they are hybridizing. So we have the 2 species, also hybrid populations. And what happens sometimes when species hybridize is you get something called hybrid vigor. That's what, of course, corn researchers use to develop hybrid corn varieties. And it's used, of course, in agriculture widely, but it also happens in nature. So we basically have this large gene pool of white pines. We have the two species plus the hybrids. And that's really important because the only thing that can resist white pine blister rust, which is on the way, coming down from the north and also up from the south, it's basically a horrible problem on the Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. So it's just inevitable that that's going to be here. And we have a large gene pool that is going to be able to select individuals that would produce seed that would resist this devastating disease. In fact, recent research has documented seed grown from white pines from the Santa Fe National Forest are in fact resistant after 7 years of research in Oregon, in which they were basically grown in this spray tunnel and just exposed to the spores of white pine blister rust, and they survived. At least about 70% of them survived, which is the highest percentage ever documented. So what is the Forest Service doing? Our good friends of the Forest Service, they're cutting down the white pines. Is absolutely insane. So in the agency, of course, there is divisions, as there are in any large organizations. There's the line officers, so the district foresters, district rangers, the regional foresters, and then the chief of the Forest Service and his staff in Washington. So the line officers, those are people that make decisions. That's where the funding goes. And then you have the support staff. You have the archaeologists, you have the watershed specialists, you have the wildlife biologists, and you also have the plant pathologists. So the plant pathologists, there's two here in the Southwest, in the 11 National Forests, 22 million acres, two plant pathologists, one in Arizona, one here in Albuquerque in New Mexico. So they know what they're doing is crazy, but they don't have the power to confront a line officer and tell them what they're doing is crazy, because that risk all sorts of things, their career advancement. But so it's left to us on the outside to raise the issue of the good science. So 7 years ago, I started doing this with a simple letter saying, gosh, you guys are cutting down the white pines, and that's biologically unwarranted. So the Forest Service is required, of course, to use the best available scientific information. That is the standard under the National Forest Management Act, passed back in the 70s. So cutting down white pines, reducing the gene pool is not the best available science. It's amazing how much you can be ignored. That original letter was never answered by the forest supervisor. So we've been pounding away ever since. So now we have got them to take out white pine as a species to cut when they give the orders to the fuel reduction crowd, which usually are contract loggers coming in from the Northwest. So that's kind of a negative victory. Not saying preserve white pine. It says don't cut white. It's not on the list. On the list is white fir and Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, but southwestern white pine or white pine is not on the list. So we are advocating for a forest plan amendment. The Santa Fe National Forest instituted a new plan in 2022, and of course they failed to mention anything about white pine conservation. Now, other national forests have the Apache Stickgrave in Arizona, the Cibola National Forest here in New Mexico. For some reason, I wonder why the Santa Fe and the Carson National Forest have not instituted mandatory standards in their forest plans that would preserve the white pine population. So we're working on a forest plan amendment. Again, inside the agency, we have friends and we have enemies. The enemies don't want to have another obstacle to their fuels reduction mania. It's just another thing they have to worry about. Well, white pine is not a terribly common tree. It's not really in the category of fire risk. Um, it usually grows on ridgetops where there's frequent lightning strikes. It's not in great abundance like the ponderosa pine. That's a very fire adapted species. So, any case, they could do this very easily, but could doing it and doing it, there's a huge gap there, a gap as big as the Grand Canyon, as we say. So we're working on that one, and that's the keep us going. Now, there's lots of other issues, Josh, and I'm sure you're quite aware of some of them, and we can talk about them if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that overview. I didn't know much about the white pine, particularly that species, and that's really helpful to understand. And that's excellent that you've been making all this progress with that. So one of the main issues that Eco Integrity Alliance has been working on is around this so-called wildfire fuels reduction. I use fuels in quote. Some of us are calling it wildfire pretext logging. I know you have a term for it because you're not fond of the euphemisms either. So how do you refer to that? And just really quick for folks who don't know, they're doing all this logging. They literally want to log tens of millions of acres across the West, more if they could get their hands on it. The idea is that we somehow log, we protected the world from wildfires, whatever nonsense they're spewing. So talk maybe a little bit about the euphemism, just real quick. Like, what are your thoughts on that language?
Yeah, that's a good one because language is really important. Language should be signs of how we feel and how we think. And if we're driven by fear and a misunderstanding of the role of fire in fire adapted ecosystems, we'll say the wrong thing. In fact, the media and the major newspapers, television stations, policymakers, land managers, they often talk about a forest is being destroyed or damaged or devastated or nuked or razed or I've even heard the term moonscaped or consumed by a wildfire. I mean, think about the dry forests in the West, especially ours here in the southern part of the Rocky Mountains here in New Mexico. They've been around for thousands of years. Intense heat waves, heat domes are something that have happened in the past. They respond to them in all sorts of ways, but we can look at fire not as something that consumes the ecosystem, but actually something that renews the ecosystem, and that's exactly what high intensity large fires do. Now, the fires that of course are burning in the West today, a relatively small percentage is really high intensity, where basically all the trees are killed, and you have standing dead trees or snags left, and then down logs. These are incredibly important. These are the biological legacies that are passed on to to the rejuvenating forest. So it's also provides specialized habitat for a number of bird species. The most prominent here is the three-toed woodpecker. This woodpecker we thought was extinct in the Southwest until we had these fires that started about 20 years ago, and suddenly, they're if not abundant, they're certainly something that birders enjoy watching. They have blackbacks like the blackback woodpecker in California that when they come to a charcoal tree or a standing dead tree, they're hard to see, and they're after the beetles that come to consume the remaining nutrients in a standing dead tree and produce its brood. These beetles fly in from long distances, 20 miles or more, have very, very sensitive apparatus to detect smoke and fire, followed by the woodpecker. So that's an example of the complex early successional habitat that is created by high severity fires that is essential and should not be demonized by people who don't know what they're talking about, basically. So this is something. So when fear drives policy, you don't have rational people making decisions. You have extreme measures that suddenly become part of the vocabulary. And of course, you can't talk about clear cut anymore. You have to talk about thinning. But when you're cutting down 90% or more of the trees, in the old days, we called that clear cutting. Now, today, they're cutting down a lot of the smaller trees and leaving the larger trees. But as we know from these dry forests, from even the historical records back in the 19th century, there were abundant small trees on the landscape. And that's because the abundance of small trees, again, means a large gene pool. When a wildfire would come through, or more likely, an intense period of drought and insect like bark beetle would come through, they would not focus on the smaller trees. So bark beetle focuses on the larger trees. So to cut to the chase real quick, so we're cutting down a lot of the small trees and leaving the large trees. But when you have a bark beetle epidemic that comes in with intense drought, of which we're seeing more of because of the warming and drying climate, those large trees are dying. And we've already cut a lot of the smaller trees. We used to call that deforestation. So again, that's not part of the vocabulary, except when we talk about it happening in the third world. But that in fact is the result of misguided forest policy, driven by fear and misinformation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of misguided forest policy, yeah, unfortunately, in lots of areas, they are also cutting the large trees and the small trees. We're dealing with mature and old growth trees being logged up here in Colorado. Also, we're seeing that in Oregon. But yeah, across the board is what they're going for. But in New Mexico, you're dealing with something called let's get the name right, Taos Canyon Forest and Watershed Restoration Project.
Yeah.
This is in the Carson National Forest, 54,000 acres of commercial logging, other tree cutting, 83,000 acres of prescribed burns. So is this a good project? It says it's emergency action. It's under this emergency action authority, which is almost 1 million acres right now across the West. They're trying to protect the forests and the communities, right? Isn't it a thing to support?
Yeah, so this whole notion of emergency. So in politics, when a politician declares an emergency, that usually means fascist measures are introduced into the body politic. And that's what Hitler did famously. That's what Mussolini did. So we have to be very suspicious of emergencies. Emergencies become the status quo if we're not careful. And that's usually the case. And I think that is the case here. There is not an emergency. There is a compelling need to reduce our pollution of the atmosphere and to curb our use of fossil fuels. That should be declared an emergency. It's something that we have some control over, but how gigantic ecosystems like the Southern Rockies respond to a changed climate is not an emergency. We really don't know what we're doing. The forest does know what it's doing. So this project in the Taos Canyon is a small piece of the 1.4 million acres Enchanted Circle wildfire crisis strategy something or other. I can't remember all the acronyms, but it's part of an emergency declaration that came about at the end of Trump's era in the White House, and it's called by the name of, get this right, Wildfire Crisis Strategy. Yeah, Wildfire Crisis Strategy. And it's identified 21 of these landscapes, huge landscapes. So this is 1.4 million acres. Just to give you a sense, the whole Carson National Forest is only 1.5 million acres. It encompasses an entire ranger district, the Camino Real Ranger District. And so basically this crisis strategy has taken over the management of an entire national forest. And it, it includes private lands. It includes lands of the Taos Pueblo, the well-known Taos ski areas is a part of it as well. So it's a huge landscape, and it's an emergency. So we really can't have any decision that's made here reviewed at a higher level of the Forest Service. So it's called the objection process. It used to be called the appeals process. So that decision typically is if an objection is made to a decision, it's reviewed by a higher level person, usually at the regional office of the Forest Service, to see if it meets basic standards of best available science and meets the legal requirements, etc. Just a little side note, we appealed the project here on the Santa Fe almost 20 years ago, and we appealed to the regional forester, and the regional forester found a major problem. What they planned to do was all in roadless areas. So the Santa Fe National Forest officials didn't even know what they were planning to do, build roads and cut a lot of trees. Would happen. Let me get rid of that. Was happening in roadless areas. So basically, higher levels of review are really important. They'll uncover major errors that have frequently happened in the past. Also, they only review propose two alternatives. One, no action, doing nothing, and one, what they want to do. Now, the whole purpose of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was to have a broad range of alternatives. So, you'd have alternatives that would have less impact, alternatives that have more impact. And so the decision maker could have a choice about choosing which to follow based on certain criteria. We don't have that anymore. The Congress has restricted the number to two alternatives: no action and proposed action. So, this is all an outgrowth of this emergency declaration that's part of this gigantic national program. Now, so NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, requires federal agencies to look before they leap, to look at the impacts of their proposals in terms of what's going to happen in the long term. So both cumulative impacts, when you add up the small ones, direct impacts, and also indirect impacts. So there's a whole set of regulations that require them to take this detailed, what the courts have determined, hard look at the impacts. So they should be doing that for the program as a whole. So the wildfire crisis strategy that has already identified 21 of these enormous projects, almost 50 million acres throughout the West. And there's many more waiting to join the program. So that would be a programmatic environmental impact statement. That's not on the table. They haven't even considered doing that. And then when you get down to the Taos Canyon project, they should be doing a full environmental impact statement, because that 80,000 plus acres would be the largest project ever done on the Carson National Forest. And that's just a small part of the 1.4 million acre footprint that they want to do in the coming years. So basically, NEPA are what was called at one time the Magna Carta of the environment. So it's it's the people telling the managers of public lands, listen to us and follow the law. Um, the Magna Carta was, of course, the ancestor of our Declaration of Independence and constitutional form of government. So it's really a fundamental law. It's over 50 years old now. It was passed in the heydays in the early 70s, signed into law in 1970 by that great environmentalist, Richard Nixon. I'm being facetious, of course. He was pressured by the anti-war movement to do something positive, but not end the war in Vietnam, but to throw some crumbs at us progressives. So it's just criminal that NEPA is falling by the wayside, and it's much like our others laws in the civil landscape that are also falling by the wayside, whether it's free speech or right to assemble, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we're trying to really call attention to this quote emergency action stuff. We've been having trouble getting media to really pick up on it or understand it. So we're trying to point out, look, here is a local project, but this has got national implications. This is a larger picture. So, and thanks to you all in calling attention to this, and we're putting out a press release with Santa Fe Forest Coalition, uh, the Forest Advocate, and as well as Wild Earth Guardians to call attention to your comments on this. So you submitted comments with the Forest Service objecting to aspects of this plan, and we're going to do our best to get that out to the larger world. And that's really important, the work that you're doing. So thank you for that.
Could I, Josh, could I drill down a little bit on our comments to the Taos Canyon project? Because it's really important. And it has to do with this incredible bird, the northern goshawk. Just some quick history there. Back in the 90s, after Robin Silver had petitioned and was successfully got listed the Mexican spotted owl, which primarily inhabits the mixed conifer forest, the more mesic, the more higher elevation forest. The goshawk is a similar species that occupies and depends upon the ponderosa pine forest, the lower elevations, the drier forests. And so the Forest Service just was scared to death, quite frankly, that the goshawk would be also listed as a threatened species like the owl. And of course, ponderosa is the favorite timber species here in the Southwest, and that would put a big constraint on their management. So they basically came up with these complex set of rules called the Goshawk Management Recommendations. And they amended every single forest plan in the Southwest to require that they be instituted. You know, they're not the best in the world, but they're certainly better than nothing. They do protect nest areas. They do protect what's called a post-fledgling area around the nest. And they have some protections for the larger habitat. You know, the goshawk, male goshawk will forage over 5,000 to 6,000 acres. So, you know, it's a wide ranging forest raptor. And they just abandoned all the goshawk recommendations that back in the 90s and in early 2000s, they defended vigorously in court that this is the best available science. And we had criticized that, but agency discretion, the so-called Chevron doctrine that just got knocked down by the Supreme Court, was the rule of the land. So when there's a battle of the experts, the agency always wins that battle. So they won the battle. And then they abandoned the science. It's just criminal. And so I think the goshawk is going to come back to haunt them here. And we have made detailed comments on several projects, including Taos Canyon, pointing out their failure to protect goshawk habitat. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's an issue that a lot of people overlook, and it's something that I certainly was not
Yeah.
particularly aware of. So thank you for that. So we're dealing with a lot of wildfires right now across the West. It's a normal thing. And of course, dry, hot weather, that's when the wildfires happen. And right here in Colorado, within a 50-mile radius, I'm kind of in the middle of it. 4 wildfires started over 3 days. Now, this is in inhabited areas, basically. The Front Range of Colorado is the most busy area. So we're not talking in the middle of the national forest. We're talking about forest edge stuff, all human caused. I mean, we haven't figured out exactly what. I think they know one of them was somebody's stupid fire that got out of control. But there's been not a cloud in the sky, like single digit humidity, no lightning strikes. So these were people. So what we're dealing with a lot with the Forest Service, like that's why we have to log all of our forests, which of course, even if it worked and was effective, which it doesn't and it's not, that is an impossible task to, quote, fireproof a forest. So many of us talk about instead home hardening, that is area 1560 up to 100 feet around homes. It's been proven to be very effective. However, you're also talking about some other ways of getting to the source of where these human caused fires are starting. So what's your idea about how we can better prevent the human caused fires, which are the vast majority of the fires that are happening? We're not talking about the
Yeah.
natural fires.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, they're mostly human beings starting fires out in the woods, and they get to the woods on gas-powered vehicles on roads. So, we have a road network on national forest left over from the big logging days that's many times larger than the entire interstate highway system. There's been efforts for decades to get the Forest Service to close most of those roads, not the arterial roads, the main, gravel roads that go into the forest, but all these little two tracks that were not designed properly that bleed sediment into streams that disrupt wildlife habitat and provide access to these arsonists, So closing those roads would be significant. So what is the Forest Service doing, for example, in Taos Canyon? They want to reopen what they call reconstruct over 100 miles of those old logging roads so they can get their logging equipment on these incredibly steep slopes, over 75%. I mean, I have to walk up slopes like that on my hands and knees. They are incredibly steep, and they're going to get machines on there to cut trees. It's just insane. So closing roads instead of reconstructing and opening roads is essential. One really critical thing here is that some of those roads that they're going to reopen are so-called user created. So this is off-road vehicle people just going out to a meadow and tearing right across it, and then the next weekend more people come, and pretty soon you have a track. It's 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 not designed to reduce erosion or protect soils or avoid sensitive habitat. It's just thrill seekers making this path on our public lands, and they want to open those so-called user-created roads to do logging. It's crazy. Those roads were illegal to begin with and should be closed. Um, so restricting access by closing roads is going to have a huge benefit in terms of protecting human communities from some of these wildfires, in the West. Yeah.
That seems like a no-brainer to me. And something that people don't really understand is that this quote, fuel reduction, wildfire, pretense logging, forest clearing, whatever you want to call it. So a lot of people are like, oh, look, it's sort of a lighter touch on the forest, which is not always true. A lot of the times they actually are doing clear cutting. I've seen tons of clear cutting, mature and old growth tree logging. But let's just assume it's just here and there cutting out a tree, which let's just pretend that that's what they're doing. The reality is it encompasses a larger square mileage. over the forest. So a larger footprint, which requires even more roads. So I'm obviously not advocating for clear cutting forest, but clear cutting forest is more centralized. You get a road out there or whatever. This is bleeding everything across the forest. So what they're doing is they're doing the opposite of closing roads. They are building more and more and more roads. And many of us for years have been talking about the ecological need to rip roads, as they say, restore them back to natural habitat. They're going in the opposite direction. But your plan would actually not only ecologically restore aspects of the forest, but it would limit the amount of ingress to people who tend to start the fires, usually accidentally, sometimes intentionally. So, what are the obstacles to your plan, which I'm 100% on board?
Well, it's not, well, it's quite obvious. It's the off-road vehicle crowd. I mean, look at the typical advertisements here on the Olympics as we're watching on TV. It's these four-wheel drive vehicles ripping through wild lands. That's supposed to be um, something that excites people and gets them to buy cars. But it certainly is not something our public lands need more of. So, and also it's coming from, unfortunately, the mountain biking community. They've become quite large here in northern New Mexico. They scare the death out of simple older hikers like myself, ripping around on these hiking trails. But they want to get into the wilderness. They think they have some sort of right to get their machines in the wilderness. It's just crazy. But they're also strongly opposed to closing some of these smaller two-track, very damaging roads that were built by loggers decades ago, for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah, so the off-road folks and the mountain bike folks, and I was in denial of that for many years. I thought, no, these folks love the forest. They're on their non-motorized vehicle. Surely they would be allies. And there are some exceptions. There are some individuals who are allies. I was tabling the other day at a logging site that's right on a trail where they're doing all this nonsense wildfire logging. And there were a couple of mountain bike people who one of them actually was pretty skeptical, like, yeah, well, they're going to do what they need to do and blah blah blah. And then he came back from his bike ride and his face was like drained. He's like, you're right, they destroyed this whole area. And he gave me his card and we're engaging more. And there was another person as well. So not all the mountain bikers, we don't want to paint them all with the same brush, but I have found you are almost entirely accurate though. The Obviously the motorized vehicle folks, but the mountain bikers are not on our side. They want more access. I'm not actually even sure why they care so much about being in the wildlands anyway, because they're just, they're focused on like the rock ahead of you. They're not even like taking in. And my plan, here's my proposal, see what you think of this, is give all the mountain bikers and off-road vehicle people like a cement place to ride around, and then we'll project images of the forest to either side so they can feel like they're going through the forest and they don't actually have to go through the forest. And it's just a background for them. It's just a backdrop. So that's my proposal. But seriously though, yes, it is unfortunate. And in their minds, these are already there. You're not going to take them away from us, but we're both dealing with wanting to reduce the amount that already exists, but we're having to deal with an onslaught of increased roads. So one would think that they could at least be reasonable, but no, they're going to advocate for everything that they want, and we're going to be kind of left to try to defend it. But I do think that this idea of combining these two things, it's the ecological protection, but also where are all these fires starting? Why do so many humans create fires? They seem to just dismiss it. Well, you know how humans are going to create most of the fires. Do we? There can't be. So many of us are talking about, stricter, better regulations that are actually patrolled and enforced, right? If you have some rule in the forest up here, for instance, you can't light any campfire, but everyone's lighting campfires anyway.
Yeah.
You might as well not even have a rule. And of course, the issue would be, well, where are you going to get the funding for this? And I've got a pretty good idea of where tens of billions of dollars are being wasted. It's towards all this wildfire pretense logging.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's so much money out there now. The Forest Service is having a hard time spending it. So all this infrastructure money, that's not going to hire more staff, although sometimes it is. It's going to hire contractors. That's much easier to get the money spent quickly is to throw it at contractors. Oh my God. And the waste and abuse, in years to come, we'll find there was a lot of it, I'm sure. Misspent money. But yeah, for one of the few times in the last few decades where money has not been an issue, let's do good things with it instead of bad things as happening now. But Josh, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the bigger issues that we need to keep our eye on the prize and not forget. As we get involved in these day-to-day issues, sometimes they get pushed to the side. But there's one really great proposal that Dominic De La Sala, a great conservation biologist in Oregon, and others have proposed. It's not the first time, but it has to do with good science. So what we're seeing here, of course, the Forest Service has a whole scientific research arm. There's a research station in Fort Collins up in Colorado, and there's one here in Albuquerque and one in Flagstaff in the Southwest. And there's good scientists doing in many cases good work, but their research publications are not peer reviewed. So so you have this incredible dynamic inside a huge agency like the Forest Service to toe the line, not to raise serious questions, not to raise problems that would upset the funding cycle or go contrary to what these elaborate forest plans require, or give ammunition to the critics of the Forest Service, like us tree huggers. It's to toe the line. So requiring that Forest Service publications be peer reviewed, that seems like a no-brainer, and it would be easy to do, and it would really help get science more on an even keel instead of science being weaponized by the agency to back up their, in many cases, crazy schemes. It would also open the door to possibilities that are not on the landscape now, like directing more funding to home hardening and creating defensible space around communities. I mean, that clearly should be a priority of public safety, but it never is. Really good science to support it. So those things could see the light of day where now they're not. So peer reviewing science, Forest Service scientific work. Number two is a little bit more visionary scheme, but it's one of my favorites. It comes from Michael Kellert, an old friend of mine who's based in the East, and he's a real fan of national parks. And last time I bumped into Michael, he had a mission to visit every national park, national monument, national seashore in the country. And that is a big job. And I don't know how far he is with that, but he's certainly on the road. So his idea, again, would be very simple. It would take all the forested acres in the National Forest System. It's let's just, as a round number, it's about 100 million acres. It's actually a little bit more, but let's just say that, and just transfer that to the Park Service. So there you get out of the commercial incentive right away. The Park Service does not sell timber to private interests, does not lease land for the most part to livestock operators. And of course, there's a few exceptions. So, that would sort of be an overnight step to decommercialize public lands. Easy to do. In fact, it was done here very recently in northern New Mexico with about 100,000 acres, what we call the Valles Caldera, which is an extinct volcano, a gigantic caldera just west of Santa Fe that was in private hands during the Clinton administration. It was purchased for $100 million and transferred to this private consortium of it involves some Forest Service people, but it involved Nature Conservancy and sort of big groups like that. It was a disaster. It was Pete Dominicis that mentioned him before. It was one of his ideas toward the end of his career. Disaster. It just got transferred to the Park Service. This 100,000 acres through legislation that went through the Congress. Why not do it for every forested acre on the national forest? We'd still have national forests. We'd still have the U.S. Forest Service. They would be managing pinon and juniper woodlands and grasslands in the Great Plains, and where they can't get in too much trouble. I mean, I'm sure they would try to get into trouble, but we'd solve it. So Michael has this proposal that was most recently came to light of day in this great publication called Ecological Citizen. You can get it online. It's one of my favorite publications. It's free. Just do a search for Ecological Citizen, and the latest edition of Ecological Citizen has Michael's article about transferring national forested land to the Park Service.
Yeah, that big picture stuff is what we're all about at Eco Integrity Alliance. We have a campaign that we're launching soon. Basically, it's public lands as climate and biodiversity reserves, and the national park solution. That might be one of the ways to do it, rather than trying to beat up the Forest Service that seems to be unable to mend its ways. So that might need to be the kind of the carrot and the stick kind of approach there. So that's reasonable. And I do know Michael Kellett up in Maine. When I was working in Vermont, I was in touch with him a lot. So that's excellent to hear his name again. Yeah.
Good.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you so much for all of your work over the years. You're definitely a real inspiration. We all have a lot to learn from you. And do you have any parting words for our audience?
Just don't give up. Keep the door of possibility open. It's so arrogant to say, we'll never win. I mean, we don't know that. All we know is that we don't know. So that means keeping the door of possibility open. I wouldn't say hope exactly. Hope has too much baggage to it, but possibility, I think, is a real doable thing to keep in your heart.
We just got to get the Girl Scouts on our side again, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks, Sam. And folks can go to SantaFeForestCoalition.org. You can click on that link that'll be in the description. So thanks again, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Josh.